the queen who bathed in wine, Joanna of Naples and the plague court bloodlines, bathhouses, and the burden of queenship. In the year 1326, the air in Avignon was thick with incense and plague paranoia. The papal court, temporarily exiled from Rome, was crammed into the fortified French city like an overburdened hive. Here, amidst layers of ecclesiastical opulence and bureaucratic squabbling, a young girl named Joanna of Anjou was born into a world she neither asked for nor would ever escape. Her name would one day be spoken with the kind of disapproval saved for women who held power too early and too long. She would become Queen of Naples, Countess of Provence, and the target of more than one papal inquest. And yet, it is not her laws or wars that bring us here tonight, but her bathtubs, filled allegedly with red wine. This, of course, is probably not true, but the rumor has persisted for centuries, passed down in hushed tones and half-laughs, a blend of misogyny and medieval tabloid journalism. In the age of plague, where clean water was rare and leprosy common, the bathing habits of a queen became a matter of political interest. The story of Joanna is riddled with these details, the kind that fill court documents, not poems. The House of Anjou and the unfortunate crown Joanna's dynasty. The Capetian House of Anjou was a cadet branch of French royalty, perched on the Neapolitan throne like a foreign bird in a southern cage. Naples, a jewel of trade and disease, was perpetually unstable. Its ports brought wealth and contagion. Its citizens both venerated and hated their rulers. Joanna's grandfather, King Robert the Wise, was a man of contradictions, a learned king with a volatile court. When he died in 1343, he left the throne not to a strong warrior or seasoned nobleman, but to his 16-year-old granddaughter, Joanna. Her coronation was the first of its kind in southern Italy. A woman anointed in full regalia, seated upon a golden throne, flanked by priests and muttering scribes. Almost immediately, the question arose: how can a woman rule a city of such importance, with its naval base, its papal loyalties, and its incessant bickering nobility? The answer, it seemed, was to marry her off. Quickly. The marriage to Andrew of Hungary. Her cousin Andrew, a prince of Hungary, arrived in Naples a year later with all the subtlety of a diplomatic disaster. A teenager himself, where Joanna was thoughtful, some would say calculating, Andrew was brash, violent, and eager to exercise a king's power. There were whispers, always whispers, that Joanna had no intention of letting him rule alongside her. Whether true or not, the resentment in the royal bedchamber quickly found its way into the streets. In 1345, Andrew was found hanging by a noose in a corridor of the royal palace. The queen's enemies were swift, accusing her of murder, witchcraft, and all manner of womanly betrayal. the papal inquisition and political decay, to the papacy, then still headquartered in Avignon, the situation was intolerable. A female monarch, suspected of killing her husband, now sat on a throne technically under the protection of the Church. A papal inquest was launched. Envoys were dispatched. Witnesses were interrogated. But in the style of all great medieval legal proceedings, the evidence was murky, the testimonies contradictory, and the outcome, and yet, Joanna survived it. Barely. She married again, Louis of Taranto this time, and once more held Naples with a fragile grip. The plague arrived soon after. In 1348, the Black Death rolled through Europe like a divine scythe. It hit Naples particularly hard. Thousands died within weeks. The dead were dumped into mass graves. The court, always a superstitious machine, demanded purification rituals, astrologers, and omens. It was during this time that the tales of Joanna's bathing rituals began to take hold. A queen who soaked in red wine, they said, to ward off plague, to restore youth, to imitate Roman empresses. It is unlikely that such baths occurred in any regular sense. Red wine, after all, was expensive and better drunk than wasted. But to the peasants and petitioners at the palace gates, it made sense. Here was a woman with the power to murder her husband and avoid justice. Surely she could afford to bathe like Cleopatra. Life inside a decaying kingdom. But what did life at the Neapolitan court actually look like? Here, the boring details become important. Court records show expenditures on olive oil, perfumed soaps, and imported textiles. Bathhouses, some private, some semi-public, were maintained with strict schedules. Servants rotated through assignments, drawing hot water, grinding spices, disposing of used linens. The hygiene of the court was a matter of statecraft. Even amidst plague and war, cleanliness was seen as a marker of divine favor. Joanna's routines, though romanticized later, would have followed the rhythms of noble survival. Early mornings began with prayer and correspondence. Midday brought public audiences, feasts, sometimes sparse due to economic strain, and royal decrees. The evenings were quieter, often filled with music, discussion, and whispered plots. It is in this setting, a court plagued by death, threatened by foreign invasion, and obsessed with legitimacy, that Joanna's life unfolded. The role of rumor and reputation. Rumor in medieval Europe was a political weapon. Queens were especially vulnerable to it. Unlike kings, whose authority was seen as martial and divinely appointed, queens had to prove themselves constantly through virtue, fertility, and loyalty. Joanna, unmarried after her second husband died of illness, refused to fade into the background. She married twice more, each time to men of strategic importance. The fourth marriage, to Otto of Brunswick, was particularly unpopular. Rumors escalated once again. She had lovers, they said. Poisons in her ring. She conspired with Jews and Muslims. She read books meant only for priests. She bathed in blood, or wine, or both. Her enemies, especially in Hungary and the Papal States, used these claims to justify political action. Prelude to a fall. By the 1370s, Joanna's reign was becoming untenable. She had backed the wrong pope during the Western Schism, aligning herself with Clement VII of Avignon against Urban VI in Rome. This would prove fatal. Urban excommunicated her, declared her unfit to rule, and granted Naples to Charles of Durazzo, Joanna's cousin and a Hungarian loyalist. Joanna was captured in 1382. Imprisoned in the castle of Muro Lucano, she was strangled to death with a silken cord, a method reserved for nobility. And yet, centuries later, we still ask, was she guilty? Was she cruel? Or was she simply a woman in power during an age that could not abide such a thing? Was her wine-bathing myth a punishment or a projection? What really happened in the corridors of Naples? And what secrets did those perfumed walls hold? Power, papacy, and the politics of survival. The image of Queen Joanna soaking in crimson wine may have captured imaginations. But the reality of her reign was far more tangled and exhausting than rumor could ever convey. To truly understand why she ruled as she did, and why so many saw her as scandalous, we must drift deeper into the machinery of medieval politics, papal intrigue, and the grinding day-to-day survival of a queen hemmed in by enemies on every side. The struggle to rule alone. When Joanna ascended the throne in 1343, she was barely 17. Young monarchs were not unusual in medieval Europe, but young female monarchs ruling without a male co-ruler were nearly unthinkable. Naples was a vital link in the chain of Mediterranean trade, a kingdom wealthy in agricultural exports, silver, and silk. For the papacy, then still exiled in Avignon, the Neapolitan crown was more than symbolic. It was a political anchor in the south of Italy. But power always came with strings. As part of her coronation, the Pope insisted that Joanna marry her cousin, Andrew of Hungary, ensuring continued Angevin and papal influence. While their union was meant to stabilize the realm, it quickly unraveled. Andrew demanded coronation as king, not merely prince consort. Neapolitan nobles resisted. Tensions boiled until that fateful night in 1345, when Andrew was found dead, strangled and thrown from a window during a hunting retreat in Aversa. Joanna's political enemies immediately accused her of masterminding the assassination. Though no definitive proof ever surfaced, the stain on her reputation never faded. The Hungarian royal court howled for blood. The papacy, concerned about maintaining balance, hesitated to condemn or absolve her outright. In the midst of this scandal, Joanna did something rare for a medieval queen. She refused to be sidelined or forced into monastic retirement. Instead, she doubled down on ruling alone. That decision would define her entire reign. A queen at war. By 1347, Naples was engulfed in turmoil. Hungarian armies, led by Andrew's brother, King Louis I, descended upon the kingdom, determined to avenge Andrew's death and seize the throne. Joanna fled. There, before Pope Clement VI, she defended herself in a grueling legal battle that dragged on for months. Court documents reveal meticulous questioning, testimony from dozens of nobles and servants, and conflicting accounts of the murder. Ultimately, Joanna was acquitted, not because she was necessarily innocent, but because convicting her would have destabilized papal authority in southern Italy. For a hefty sum of 80,000 florins, essentially a political bribe, she secured papal blessing for her rule, and, even more radically, secured papal approval to remarry a man of her choosing, Louis of Taranto. This marriage restored her throne, but not her freedom. The kingdom remained fractured. Nobles plotted in smoky chambers, and Hungarian spies haunted every port. To govern Naples, Joanna relied on calculated diplomacy, rewarding loyal barons with titles, keeping papal legates close, and ensuring the city's merchant classes were the plague's shadow. As Joanna returned to power, the Black Death swept through Europe like a biblical judgment. Arriving in Naples by ship in 1348, the disease decimated the population. Chroniclers describe corpses stacked in the streets, the stench of burning pitch to mask the smell of decay, and priests refusing last rites for fear of infection. The royal court, though isolated in fortified palaces, was not immune. Several high-ranking officials died. Even some of Joanna's own attendants succumbed. This crisis forced the queen to make a series of unglamorous but crucial decisions. Enforcing quarantines. City gates were partially sealed. Ships from plague-ridden ports were turned away. Mass graves. It was during this time of crisis that rumors of her wine baths intensified. Wine, considered purifying and medicinal, was poured into basins for washing hands and wounds. The sight of a queen using wine for hygiene, while peasants could barely drink it, fed a narrative of decadent excess. Chroniclers, especially those hostile to Joanna, would later embellish this into full-body immersions, a scandal that lingered for centuries. Religious politics and papal tensions. Joanna's relationship with the papacy was one of constant negotiation. While her rule depended on papal legitimacy, she refused to act as a mere puppet of Avignon or Rome. She cultivated ties with the Franciscan order, offered protection to Jewish communities during times of persecution, and sponsored translations of Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. These actions, while enlightened by medieval standards, provoked backlash from conservative clergy. By the 1370s, the church itself was divided in the Western Schism. Two popes claiming authority, Urban VI in Rome and Clement VII in Avignon, Joanna, calculating as ever, sided with Clement VII, believing Avignon to be more sympathetic to her dynasty. This decision proved disastrous. Urban VI excommunicated Joanna, stripping her of her titles and sanctioning her overthrow. This was no mere theological spat. Excommunication meant Joanna's rule was, in the eyes of much of Christendom, illegitimate. Nobles who had once bent the knee now had papal permission to rebel. The economic burden of queenship. Behind the glamour of royal processions and jewel-encrusted crowns lay the tedious, grinding reality of managing a medieval kingdom's finances. Naples relied. Joanna's administration had to balance the crown's extravagant expenses with frequent military campaigns and the staggering costs of maintaining papal favor. Historical ledgers show meticulous records, payments to mercenaries, purchases of spices and silks for diplomatic gifts, repairs to war-damaged fortresses. One entry even details the import of exotic birds from North Africa, not for pleasure, but as part of a diplomatic gift meant to secure an alliance with Aragon. Queens, unlike kings, were expected to be both political figures and moral exemplars. Every coin spent was scrutinized more harshly than a king's indulgence might be. Joanna's rumored excesses, bathing in wine, adorning herself with foreign luxuries, were likely exaggerated reactions to an unavoidable truth. A queen who failed to appear wealthy and powerful risked losing credibility in a male-dominated political sphere. Personal life behind the throne. Beneath the layers of politics, Joanna's personal life remained a subject of fascination and distortion. Despite 4 marriages, Andrew of Hungary, Louis of Taranto, James IV of Majorca, and Otto of Brunswick, Joanna bore no surviving children. In an age where dynastic security depended on heirs, this was catastrophic. Succession crises loomed over Naples for decades. Chroniclers, eager for scandal, insinuated affairs and whispered about possible poisonings. Some suggested that Joanna deliberately avoided childbirth to maintain autonomy. An unlikely but persistent rumor. What we know from palace documents is quieter. References to miscarriages, illnesses, and failed pregnancies. Tragic, but unremarkable realities for many medieval women. Within her private chambers, letters reveal a different Joanna, one who wrote of loneliness during military campaigns, who in legal reforms aimed at protecting widows and orphans. Far from the lecherous queen of legend, she appears in these fragments as a ruler burdened by survival, constrained by forces beyond her control. The gathering storm. By the early 1380s, Joanna's power was crumbling. The excommunication by Urban VI had opened the gates for Charles of Durazzo, a cousin aligned with Hungary, to invade Naples with papal blessing. Many Neapolitan barons, weary of decades of instability, defected to Charles's side. Despite her political acumen, Joanna's resources were depleted. Years of tribute payments, military campaigns, and plague recovery had drained the treasury. Mercenaries demanded payment in advance. Fortresses fell due to unpaid garrisons, and her appeals to France and Avignon yielded little more than empty promises. In 1382, Charles's forces captured Joanna. Unlike other dethroned rulers who were exiled or forced into convents, she was taken to the castle of Muro Lucano and kept under heavy guard. Contemporary accounts suggest she was initially treated with some measure of respect befitting a queen, but this mercy did not last. On a spring day in May 1382, Joanna of Naples was strangled to death with a silken cord. She was 56. No public trial, no papal intervention, no ceremony, just silence. Her body was buried hastily, and Charles of Durazzo claimed the throne. Yet even in death, Joanna's reputation refused to fade. To some, she remained the murderess of Aversa. To others, a tragic heroine, wrongly maligned, a victim of her time. Centuries later, historians still debate. Was Joanna a tyrant cloaked in luxury, or a skilled survivor of medieval realpolitik? Was her legacy ruined by scandalous exaggerations? And perhaps more curiously, how much of the wine-bathing legend was deliberate propaganda, crafted by enemies who knew that sometimes the most effective weapon is not a sword, but a story, death, legacy, and the quiet power of memory? You now know Joanna's reign ended with a cord of silk wrapped around her neck, a quiet, royal death behind stone walls. No last speech, no courtroom drama, no poetic execution, just disappearance. But what happens when a queen dies in disgrace, without heirs, and with a trail of scandal in her wake? This final section of our story is not about political maneuvers or dramatic conflicts. It is about what lingers after the blood dries and the royal seals are broken. It's about the mundane persistence of reputation, paperwork, whispers, and silence. About how history remembers or forgets those like Joanna, whose lives didn't conform to comfortable legends. In death, Joanna of Naples entered an even murkier realm, the death nobody mourned. After Joanna's murder in May 1382, her body was buried without fanfare, reportedly in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Naples. No grand procession, no royal mass, no mourning crowds in black silk, no papal condolence. The woman who had once ruled a Mediterranean kingdom was interred like a common criminal, or perhaps more like an inconvenience. Charles of Durazzo, her cousin and self-styled successor, had little interest in publicizing her demise. To him, Joanna's legacy was a political liability. He wanted the throne unquestioned, unclouded by claims of assassination or intrigue. In a calculated move, he ordered the erasure of many of her surviving royal decrees and reversed several of her reforms. Where her name had been inscribed on civic projects, it was quietly removed. In royal annals, she was referred to, if at all, with curt dismissal. Joanna, formerly queen, but the paper trail she left behind. In the humid vaults of Neapolitan archives, scribes continued copying legal records long after her death. Charters she signed. Land disputes she resolved. wills she witnessed. A dry but rich tapestry of activity that reveals the ordinary grind of her administration. Unlike the flash of royal decrees we associate with kings, Joanna's paperwork reveals a queen deeply involved in local affairs. Petitions from widows, disputes between stonemasons, laws regulating bread prices. Her rulings were often compassionate, but restrained, favoring compromise over punishment. She enacted statutes allowing women to inherit property more freely. She reduced the salt tax in famine-prone regions. She encouraged civic guilds to establish mutual aid funds, an early form of social insurance. These acts were not revolutionary, but they mattered, and they endure quietly in the ledgers. Ironically, this paper trail contradicts the mythos built around her. The image of a decadent monarch bathing in barrels of Bordeaux becomes harder to accept when juxtaposed against the image of a ruler debating grain tariffs with town elders. A patron of thought and the written word, Joanna's love for literature and theology also left its mark. She was a patron of the humanist scholar Giovanni Boccaccio, author of the Decameron. He addressed his work, De Mulieribus Claris, on famous women to her, a gesture rare for a woman ruler of the time. Boccaccio saw in Joanna not just a queen, but an intellectual equal, a woman who could read, argue, and reflect. Her court became a gathering place for thinkers. She commissioned translations of Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. She protected Jewish physicians and scholars, often when pogroms raged elsewhere, given the ever-watchful eye of inquisitors. Some of these discussions were transcribed, and scholars argue they may have influenced minor shifts in church debates during the later 14th century. Again, nothing revolutionary, but consistent, deliberate, and thoughtful. The power of Joanna's patronage wasn't flamboyant. It wasn't thunderous. It was like the bath she supposedly took in wine, steeped, quiet, redolent of something just on the edge of memory. The women who followed Joanna's queenship, scandalized though it became, set a precedent. Her rule, however tumultuous, was an early example of a woman wielding full sovereign power in medieval Europe. Later female monarchs would face the same pressures: to marry for politics, to breed heirs, to keep silent during war. But Joanna did not keep silent. She did not step aside. Her story was read and misread by generations of rulers. Isabella of Castile, Elizabeth I of England, and even Catherine de' Medici would later be measured by their ability to rule without or despite men. These women operated in a world Joanna helped define, whether consciously or not. They may not have invoked her name, but her ghost lingered in every council room where a woman sat at the head of the table. The myths that refused to die. As decades passed, the rumors surrounding Joanna only grew stranger. Chroniclers, looking for moral lessons, recast her life as a cautionary tale. In one account, she was seduced by a Saracen prince and murdered her husband in a fit of lust. In another, She was said to have kept a court of perversions, where foreign alchemists and female courtiers practiced witchcraft and drank blood. These tales, clearly absurd, served the purposes of later historians and clerics who disapproved of powerful women. By the Renaissance, Joanna had become a villainess in sermons and political treatises alike. But others were kinder. Neapolitan citizens in the 15th century remembered her not as a villain, but as a patron of charities and orphanages. In oral tradition, she became something more ambiguous. The queen who ruled alone, who faced betrayal and plague and Rome, and who died for it. Even the legend of her bathing in wine became something less scandalous and more symbolic over time. For some, it was indulgent. For others, purifying. For still others, a metaphor for a woman who tried to keep decay at bay with whatever power she could muster. What is a scandal without a memory? Historians today wrestle with Joanna's legacy not because it's unclear, but because it's contradictory. She was brave and shrewd, but also politically disastrous. She was compassionate and forward-thinking. She protected the poor and the sick, but ruled from palaces full of perfume and marble. This complexity has been flattened by centuries of simplification. The image of a woman bathing in wine is easy to remember. A queen balancing trade deficits, mediating labor disputes, and issuing grain subsidies is harder. But history is made not of the easy myths, but of the long, slow accumulation of choices. Joanna's reign may not have been heroic, but it was resilient. And in an age of plague, betrayal, and clerical politics, resilience might have been the most radical thing of all. Reflections. Why remember Joanna now? In many ways, Joanna of Naples is the perfect figure for boring history. Not because she was uninteresting, but because the truth of her life lies in the details that are so often overlooked. Her careful edits to property laws for women, her quiet defiance of papal overreach, her ability to rule, write, think, and perhaps most importantly, persist. She was not an ideal queen, but she was real. And that more than any bath of wine may be what truly threatened the world she lived in. In her survival, she exposed the fragility of the systems around her. And in her death, she became a story. A mirror, perhaps, of our fear of women who refuse to vanish. So next time you hear a rumor about a queen who bathed in wine, pause and ask, what truth lies beneath the indulgence? What fears does the fantasy conceal? What history did we forget because it wasn't dramatic enough? The birds, the hands, and the birth of a guild. It is easy to imagine medieval Europe as a world of knights, castles, and clashing swords. Yet, beneath the banners and battles that fill history books, there existed another world entirely. One of trades, markets, and seemingly insignificant professions. One such trade was goose plucking, an occupation so ordinary that few bothered to record its details, yet so essential that it feathered the pillows of kings and filled the inkpots of scribes for centuries. This story begins not in a royal court or a famous battlefield, but in a damp riverside town where flocks of honking geese waddled between thatched huts, their down and quills the lifeblood of an emerging medieval industry. Here, the Guild of Goose Pluckers was born, not with pomp, but with necessity. The humble goose, a medieval treasure. To understand goose plucking, you must first understand the goose itself. Unlike chickens, which were raised primarily for meat and eggs, geese were multi-purpose animals. They were larger, hardier, and better suited to grazing in common pastures. A single goose could live for over a decade, producing down feathers for bedding, quills for writing, and meat for feasts long before its final slaughter. In medieval Europe, where winters were long and houses poorly insulated, goose down became a prized commodity. Nobles demanded feather-filled mattresses and duvets. Monasteries used them to stuff sleeping pallets for their weary monks. Even common households tried to gather enough feathers to pad simple blankets against the cold drafts of stone cottages. But extracting down feathers was not as simple as plucking a dead bird. In fact, the highest quality down came from live plucked geese, a practice that sounds brutal to modern ears, but was a normalized part of medieval husbandry. Farmers discovered that gently removing mature feathers while leaving the protective layer beneath allowed geese to regrow plumage repeatedly throughout their lives. This process could be done 2 or 3 times a year, meaning one goose could supply years of valuable feathers before it was ever butchered. The rise of the goose plucker. Goose plucking was physically demanding, requiring patience and skill. Novices risked injuring birds or damaging feathers, which reduced their value. Expert pluckers knew how to restrain a goose, calm it, and deftly remove only the mature down. The work left hands raw and nicked by sharp beaks. The air was thick with floating tufts of white, sticking to sweat and wool tunics alike. By the 12th century, as towns expanded and markets grew more sophisticated, specialized goose pluckers emerged. No longer were feathers just a byproduct of farm life. They became a commodity traded across regions. A skilled plucker could earn steady coin, supplying feathers to bedding makers, parchment shops, and even fletchers, who used feathers for arrows. With money came organization. Informal associations of pluckers formed to protect their trade from unskilled laborers who undercut prices. Guilds. The medieval trade unions. Guilds were a hallmark of medieval economic life. Whether one made shoes, brewed ale, or forged iron, joining a guild offered protection, bargaining power, and a sense of community. Members swore oaths, paid dues, and followed strict rules governing quality and conduct. In return, guilds regulated who could practice a craft, set fair prices, and defended members from exploitation by wealthy patrons or corrupt officials. The Goose Pluckers Guild. Apprenticeship was central to the guild's structure. Young boys and girls, often from poor, rural families, were bound to masters for years of training. They learned not only plucking techniques, but also the broader trade network. How to sort feathers by softness, how to barter at market stalls, how to recognize fraudulent buyers who mixed goose and chicken down to cheat customers. At the end of apprenticeship, journeymen underwent tests, often plucking a set number of geese within a strict time while preserving feather quality. Before earning full membership, the goose feather economy. Feathers moved along complex supply chains that stretched far beyond the muddy banks where geese grazed. After plucking, feathers were washed in river water, dried in smoky huts to ward off lice, and sorted by size and texture. The finest down was reserved for bedding destined for noble households, while sturdier feathers became writing quills or fletching for arrows. Bedding. High-born lords demanded mattresses so thick they sank into them like ships at harbor. A single royal bed could require feathers from hundreds of geese. Even wealthy merchants competed to own feather pillows, a clear sign of status. Writing. As literacy spread among clergy and administrators, quills became essential tools. Goose feathers were ideal for their flexibility and durability. Scribes in monasteries and royal chanceries might wear through dozens of quills, copying a single illuminated manuscript. Weapons. Feathers fletched arrows for hunters and soldiers alike. A well-fletched arrow flew straighter and farther, meaning skilled goose pluckers indirectly influenced battlefields. Markets for feathers extended to distant cities. Seasonal life of a goose plucker. Plucking was not a year-round task. It followed the natural molting cycles of geese, typically in spring and late summer. During peak seasons, guild workshops bustled from dawn until dusk. Goose herders arrived in caravans, honking flocks in tow. Pluckers worked in teams, restraining birds, removing feathers, sorting and bundling them into sacks bound for markets. Outside of these seasons, goose pluckers turned to related trades, breeding geese, slaughtering and butchering, tanning hides, or even crafting bedding themselves. The guild maintained strict records of output and ensured fair distribution of work, preventing wealthy merchants from monopolizing the trade. Life was harsh. Feathers clung to everything. Workers inhaled fine down that irritated lungs. Fingers were often calloused, and bites from angry birds were common. Yet, guild feasts provided moments of joy. Roasted goose dinners, games and songs celebrating their craft. St. Martin's Day in November marked the end of the plucking season, when geese were slaughtered for winter feasts and feathers tallied for annual dues. Regulations and conflicts. Like all guilds, the goose pluckers had their share of disputes. Records from Bruges mention fines for selling foul feathers, down that had not been properly cleaned, or for plucking too early and harming geese. Violators faced public shaming or expulsion, losing the right to trade legally. Conflicts with other guilds also arose. Fletchers accused pluckers of hoarding the best feathers. Scribes complained of inconsistent quill quality. Betting makers demanded lower prices. Mediations were common, with city councils stepping in to arbitrate. The guild's most pressing conflict, however, was with traveling feathermongers. Unauthorized traders who roamed the countryside buying feathers cheaply from farmers and undercutting guild markets. These independent traders faced raids from guild members and occasional arrests, but they persisted, showing that even in the rigid structure of medieval economies, gray markets thrived. Invisible foundations of society. Without goose pluckers, nobles would have lacked their sumptuous beds, scribes their quills, and archers their steady arrows. Yet the craft received little recognition. Chroniclers rarely mentioned the trade, and when they did, it was usually to mock its low status. But imagine a medieval monastery without quills to copy scripture. A royal council without documents penned by skilled scribes. A battlefield without arrows true enough to pierce enemy armor. These seemingly grand historical events all relied quietly on the labor of men and women hunched over geese by riversides, fingers raw, breath fogging in cold morning air. Stained monasteries to the complex web of medieval commerce that carried feathers across continents. The spread of feathers across Europe. By the late 13th century, goose feathers had become one of Europe's most traded soft goods. Though not as valuable as spices or silk, their demand was steadier and less volatile. Unlike grain, which rotted, or fabrics, which faded, feathers could be stored for years if kept dry. Merchants traveled from the rural centers of plucking, small towns near wetlands and rivers where geese thrived, to urban trade hubs like Bruges, Lübeck, and Paris. Records from Hanseatic League archives describe feather bales being loaded onto cogs and carried to Baltic ports, eventually reaching Scandinavian kingdoms where winter bedding was critical for survival as towns grew richer and universities blossomed. Demand for feathers increased. Goose plucking shifted from a rustic side job to a cornerstone of urban economies. By the late Middle Ages, guild records show hundreds of members across Europe, binding entire communities to the humble bird that had started it all. But how did these guilds manage to survive the political upheavals, plagues, and wars of their era? And what happened when power shifted away from manual trades towards centralized royal and merchant control? Feathers, trade routes, and the silent power of down. To grasp the true weight of goose plucking in medieval society, one must step back from the plucking benches and feather-strewn huts of rural guild halls and observe how these soft, fragile tufts shaped not just beds and arrows, but trade, politics, and even law. In this section, we drift from the muddy riverbanks to bustling city markets. From parchment in England, medieval Londoners relied heavily on imported feathers. While English geese were plentiful, large-scale plucking operations were rare, forcing English bedding makers and fletchers to purchase Flemish or French feathers at high prices. By the 14th century, the English crown had instituted customs duties specifically for feather imports, a testament to their economic significance. Goose feathers as writing tools. Feathers were not only bedding material, they were also the lifeblood of medieval literacy. Quills made from goose feathers were the dominant writing instrument from the early Middle Ages until the steel pen emerged centuries later. The perfect quill required feathers of a certain size and strength, usually from the primary flight feathers of the left wing, which curved naturally for right-handed scribes. Monastic scriptoria consumed thousands of quills each year. A single illuminated manuscript could exhaust a small sack of feathers, as scribes frequently trimmed and replaced worn tips. In universities, growing rapidly in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, student scribes demanded cheaper, durable quills, driving guilds to adapt production methods to meet varying price points. Specialized feather dressers within the Goose Pluckers Guild emerged, trained specifically in selecting, curing, and shaping feathers for writing. These artisans worked closely with parchment makers and ink suppliers, creating a miniature ecosystem of knowledge production. Without them, the intellectual blossoming of the High Middle Ages, the preservation of Aristotle, the spread of canon law, the scholastic debates would have been impossible. Feathers on the battlefield. Feathers also played a role in war. Archery required precise fletching, 3 feathers carefully glued to an arrow shaft to stabilize its flight. Poorly fletched arrows wobbled and fell short, while well-made ones could pierce chainmail at remarkable distances. Guilds supplied these feathers to fletchers, who in turn outfitted armies. During the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, English longbowmen famously devastated French knights at battles like Crécy and Agincourt. Behind every flight of arrows loosed into the sky were thousands of goose feathers, stripped, sorted, and sold months earlier by anonymous pluckers. Interestingly, wartime demand sometimes caused feather shortages in domestic markets, driving up the cost of bedding and quills. Chronicles note complaints from scholars and priests unable to find affordable writing tools during military campaigns. Kings, eager to secure supplies, occasionally issued royal decrees reserving feathers for military use, a medieval form of resource rationing. Trade networks and the feather fairs. By the 14th century, feather trade had grown sophisticated enough to warrant dedicated markets, annual feather fairs, and rural pluckers gathered to negotiate bulk contracts. Buyers inspected feathers, much like modern cotton traders examined bales, judging quality by color, cleanliness, and softness. Contracts were sealed with waxed seals and witnessed by guild. Guild officers. Prices fluctuated seasonally, influenced by molting cycles, weather, and political unrest that might disrupt supply routes. Surviving ledgers from Bruges Guildhall show astonishing detail. Bundles of down, sorted by region, Flemish white, Bohemian gray, with notes on preferred use, fine bedding, writing quill, merchant-grade arrow fletching. Transport was risky. Feathers were light, but bulky, making them vulnerable to theft or loss in transit. Caravans guarded by armed escorts carried shipments along trade roads riddled with bandits. River barges occasionally capsized, scattering feather bales downstream. Like snow, merchants insured shipments, but many fortunes were lost to piracy or war. Guild organization and internal politics, rudimentary healthcare for injured pluckers. Orphans of deceased members were often raised within the guild, trained as apprentices, and guaranteed future employment. A remarkable social safety net for the medieval world. Feathers and the church. The church, ever entwined with economic life, had its own stake in feathers. Monastic orders purchased vast quantities for bedding and quills. Cathedrals commissioned feather-stuffed cushions for choir stalls and bishops' thrones. Wealthy abbots sometimes demanded entire shipments of white down to line ceremonial vestments. But ecclesiastical demand also led to moral debates. Preachers occasionally condemned feather-filled luxury as decadent. One Dominican sermon from 1320 railed against pillows of pride, arguing that the faithful should sleep on straw like Christ himself. Despite such rhetoric, clergy rarely gave up their comforts. A famous anecdote tells of a scandal hushed up by bribes to feather guilds. Feathers also touched theology more subtly. Quills wrote sermons, papal bulls, and university disputations that shaped doctrine for centuries. Without goose pluckers, the very language of medieval Christianity, its canon law, its philosophical treatises, its illuminated Bibles, would have remained unwritten. Health hazards and survival. The work of plucking and processing feathers carried hidden dangers. Chronic exposure to feather dust caused respiratory illnesses, later described as feather lung. Cuts from sharp quills often became infected in an era before antibiotics. Some workers developed permanent calluses and joint pain from restraining geese for hours. Guilds recognized these hazards. Medical expenses for injured members were covered from communal funds. Herbal remedies, eucalyptus oils, thyme infusions were prescribed for coughs and infections. Feathers were cleaned in vinegar or boiled in copper vats to kill parasites. Despite these measures, life expectancy for full-time pluckers was shorter than for many other trades. Yet the work endured, passed down through families. Oral histories collected centuries later tell of mothers teaching daughters to calm squawking birds with soft hums, of fathers crafting special knives for feather dressing. It was labor rooted in memory, honed by necessity, economic resilience in a fragile world. The 14th century brought calamities that tested the goose feather economy. The Great Famine, the Black Death, and repeated wars. Plague decimated guild membership. Entire workshops vanished, their masters dead or fled. For a time, feathers became scarce and astronomically expensive. Yet the trade survived. Rural farmers, less affected than cities, kept geese alive. Surviving guilds merged or absorbed smaller ones, consolidating power. When populations recovered, demand for bedding and writing tools surged anew. Feathers, unlike luxuries such as pearls or silks, were tied to basic needs: warmth, communication, and warfare. This resilience allowed the guilds to rebound even stronger than before. The slow decline of manual plucking as the late Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance. Subtle changes began to erode the traditional craft. Merchant houses gained greater control over production, bypassing guild protections. Feathers from distant lands, such as swan and ostrich, entered European markets, competing with goose down. By the 16th century, mechanical devices began to appear for stripping feathers, reducing reliance on skilled manual pluckers. Still, for centuries after Joanna of Naples soaked in wine and kings battled in arrow storms, humble goose pluckers kept working. They survived upheaval not by power or privilege, but by understanding the rhythms of nature and the quiet needs of society. So much depended on these small, weightless tufts: royal comfort, scholarly progress, military triumph. And yet, for all this importance, goose pluckers remained invisible in chronicles, footnotes to larger events. But what happened to the guild when cities began to industrialize and wealthy merchants sought to control every aspect of the feather trade? Did these once proud craftsmen vanish quietly into history? Or did they adapt to a changing world in unexpected ways? Decline, transformation, and forgotten feathers. The bustling guild halls, feather fairs, and riverside workshops of medieval Europe did not last forever. Like so many quiet trades that underpinned daily life, goose plucking underwent a slow and largely unnoticed transformation. By the dawn of the modern age, the guilds that had once ensured the warmth of noble beds and the spread of handwritten knowledge had faded into obscurity. ... This final section traces that decline, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual unraveling of traditions, shaped by centuries of patient, feathered labor. It is also the story of how remnants of this craft survived, repurposed, and ultimately became a nearly invisible part of our modern world. Merchant power and the erosion of guilds. The late Middle Ages witnessed the rise of powerful merchant houses that sought to control every link of production and trade. These houses, especially in port cities like Venice and Amsterdam, established centralized feather warehouses. Unlike traditional guilds, which operated locally and upheld strict standards for membership and quality, merchants hired non-guild labor to process feathers cheaply and at scale. Guild charters began to lose their authority. City councils, once staunch defenders of guild privileges, started favoring merchants who promised higher tax revenues. Laws restricting feather trade to guild members were repealed or ignored. Feather pluckers who once worked independently or within tight-knit guild networks increasingly found themselves employed as low-wage laborers under merchant contracts, stripped of their collective bargaining power. This shift marked the beginning of the end for the Goose Pluckers Guild. By the 16th century, references to independent guilds in Northern Europe dwindled to a handful of mentions in city archives. Those that remained operated in small towns, serving local markets, without influence over long-distance trade. Technological changes and early mechanization. The art of hand-plucking live geese was painstaking and required skill honed over years. But as demand for feathers skyrocketed, driven by expanding populations, burgeoning literacy, and larger standing armies, new methods emerged to meet the scale required. Early mechanical devices, little more than rotating drums fitted with brushes, were introduced in the 17th century. These machines sped up the stripping of feathers from slaughtered birds, reducing reliance on skilled pluckers. Live plucking continued, but it was increasingly supplemented or replaced by post-slaughter harvesting in large poultry operations. Feather processing itself became industrialized. Workshops introduced vats for chemical cleaning and bleaching of feathers. Large drying racks replaced riverside huts. These innovations lowered costs and allowed merchants to flood markets with mass-produced bedding and quills, further eroding the artisanal value of guild work. The rise of the writing revolution. Ironically, the very writing culture goose pluckers had sustained for centuries contributed to their decline. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century dramatically changed. Simultaneously, feathers entered a new, unexpected domain: fashion. In Renaissance courts and later Baroque and Rococo societies, feathers became symbols of wealth and elegance. Ostrich plumes and exotic bird feathers adorned hats, fans, and gowns. Goose feathers played a lesser role but remained in use for fans and trimmings. Unlike the utilitarian guild-driven trade, this fashion boom was controlled by aristocratic tailors and colonial traders, bypassing traditional pluckers. Domestic survival and rural memory. Even as guilds dissolved, goose plucking persisted quietly in rural households. Farmers continued to pluck live geese for bedding and occasional writing quills. Diaries and estate records from 17th and 18th century Europe describe family evenings spent sorting feathers by candlelight, stuffing mattresses for daughters' dowries, or preparing quills for school children. For personal correspondence and document signing, the labor-intensive copying of manuscripts dwindled. Fewer scribes meant fewer high-quality quills were needed. Over time, as printing expanded, feather production for writing shifted from specialized artisans to bulk suppliers catering to printers and bureaucrats. The finely dressed, carefully cut quills, once prepared by master pluckers, were replaced with cheaper, mass-trimmed alternatives. By the 18th century, even these were giving way to metal nib pens, relegating quill making to ceremonial or niche uses. Feathers in warfare and fashion. War had long fueled feather demand through fletching. But as gunpowder weapons spread, archery declined. Muskets and cannons replaced longbows, slashing the need for millions of goose-feathered arrows. Fletchers who once relied on pluckers for supplies now pivoted to producing decorative feathers for military helmets and banners. But the volume was far smaller. In these rural communities, the knowledge of humane live plucking, done during natural molting periods to avoid harming birds, survived far longer than in industrial settings. Oral traditions passed techniques through generations, keeping a remnant of the medieval guild's craft alive in kitchens and barns rather than guild halls. Colonial expansion and global feather trade. As European empires expanded, feathers became part of global commerce. Colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas supplied exotic plumes, which replaced many traditional European sources. Goose feathers remained popular for bedding and quills, but competition drove down prices. Colonial trade routes funneled feathers into European ports in quantities that overwhelmed what local pluckers could produce. By the 18th century, Dutch and British companies dominated feather imports. Auctions in Amsterdam and London sold bales of feathers from around the world. The once local, guild-protected trade had become a vast, anonymous market. Goose pluckers were now one small, largely invisible cog in a global feather economy that bore little resemblance to its medieval roots. The Industrial Revolution and the end of a craft. The Industrial Revolution sealed the fate of artisanal goose plucking. Mechanized poultry farms, chemical cleaning methods, and textile machinery transformed feather processing into large-scale factory work. Sewing machines stitched feather-filled quilts and pillows faster than any medieval bedding maker could imagine. Urban workshops, staffed by poorly paid laborers, replaced the communal, regulated guild halls. Metal pens, introduced in the early 19th century, all but eliminated the quill writing industry. What remained of traditional feather use, plumes for fashion, stuffing for furniture, was supplied by slaughterhouse byproducts, not by dedicated guild pluckers. By the mid-19th century, guilds of goose pluckers no longer existed as organized bodies. Their centuries-old charters lay forgotten in dusty municipal archives. The trade had shifted fully from skilled craft to industrial process, and the identity of the medieval goose plucker disappeared into anonymity. Legacy and historical echoes. Today, few remember that such guilds ever existed. Feather pillows and duvets still fill our beds. Some luxury pens even mimic quills. Yet the hands that first made these comforts possible, those of medieval goose pluckers, are all but erased from collective memory. Their legacy survives indirectly. Modern bedding, Techniques for feather sorting and down preparation evolved directly from guild practices. Quill symbolism. The image of a feather quill endures as an emblem of writing and scholarship, even if metal and digital pens dominate. Guild structures. The social safety nets of medieval guilds foreshadowed modern trade unions, offering early forms of workers' rights and collective bargaining. But perhaps their most profound legacy is unseen. The quiet scaffolding they provided for medieval society. Without them, knowledge would have spread slower. Winters would have been colder, and wars might have been fought with blunter weapons. Their absence would have reshaped history, not through dramatic events, but through 1,000 small discomforts and inefficiencies. Reflections. Forgotten feathers. History often celebrates invention and conquest, yet survival and comfort are equally transformative forces. The Guild of Goose Pluckers exemplifies this paradox. They left no castles, waged no wars, and composed no great treatises. Their contributions were soft, weightless, and silent, and for that reason, they were forgotten. Still, there is something almost fitting about this erasure. Feathers drift, they do not cling. Perhaps their craft would one day vanish into the folds of history, just as the down they harvested vanished into the seams of quilts and the nibs of quills. Yet, next time you rest your head on a feather pillow, or see the emblem of a quill pen, you touch a fragment of their world, a faint echo of guild feasts, riverside huts, and the soft rustle of geese in medieval dawn mist. Caravans of salt, cities of paper, in the quiet rhythm of the desert, there is a silence so thick it feels physical. A hush broken only by the steady crunch of hooves across the sand and the low groans of camels under burden. For centuries, that sound defined the West African Sahel as caravans bearing slabs of salt wound their way from the northern Sahara toward the mysterious and scholarly city of Timbuktu. Today, Timbuktu is often spoken of as a metaphor for remoteness. But in the medieval world, it was anything but remote. It was the end of a network of trade routes, more sophisticated, and in some ways more orga than their European contemporaries. These were the salt roads, arteries of commerce, information, and survival that carried not just minerals and gold, but also scribes, slaves, silks, and stories. This is not a tale of empire or conquest. It is a story of survival through administration, of dust-covered ledgers, government scribes, camel registries, and the strange, quiet bureaucracy that built one of the most important trade cities in African history. The importance of salt in a hot world. Before refrigeration and modern food storage, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was survival. It preserved meat, balanced diets, and in hot, arid climates, helped the human body retain moisture and electrolytes. In West Africa, where the climate ranges from dry savanna to full-blown desert, salt was as valuable as gold. Indeed, there's a medieval Arabic saying, "In the lands of the blacks, Gold is common like sand, but salt is dearer than gold. That wasn't just poetic exaggeration. In parts of the Sahel, salt was literally used as currency, traded in slabs called amole, each weighing around 80 pounds. The principal source of this desert gold was the salt mines of Tagaza, a desolate Saharan settlement in present-day Mali and Mauritania. The salt extracted there was harvested in huge rectangular slabs from crusted underground deposits. But Tagaza had no food, no water, and no shelter to speak of. Everything, including workers, had to be imported. The town's economy functioned solely to serve the caravans. It was, in effect, a salt outpost, run by a supply chain. The caravan economy, salt from Tagaza and other Saharan mines, traveled south by camel caravan. These were not small expeditions. Some caravans numbered 1,000 to 2,000 camels, each carrying 2 or 3 massive slabs of salt, along with food supplies, trade goods, and tents. It could take 2 months or more, each carrying 2 or 3 massive slabs of salt, along with food supplies, trade goods, and tents. It could take 2 months or more to reach Timbuktu from the mines, crossing some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Each caravan had to be carefully organized. There were camel drivers, Osna, scouts, Belgid, and logistics managers who tracked supplies. Water had to be rationed to the pint. Routes were dictated by the location of wells and seasonal conditions. Too early in the dry season, and the heat killed camels. Too late, and bandits became a threat. The entire system operated with astonishing regularity. Salt caravans were timed like clockwork. Traders knew when to expect deliveries. Taxes were pre-assessed. One of the most striking features of the trans-Saharan trade was its paperwork. Far from being a chaotic frontier, it was a system of formal documents, ledgers, notarized sales, and meticulously kept lists of goods and labor. The bureaucracy that governed the salt trade was perhaps more advanced than that of many medieval European kingdoms. Timbuktu, not just a city, but a registry. By the 14th century, Timbuktu was a major terminal for these desert caravans. Founded in the 1100s by Tuareg nomads near the Niger River, the city grew into a crucial hub for trade between the desert and the forested regions of West Africa. Gold, ivory, cola nuts, leather, slaves, and manuscripts all passed through Timbuktu's markets. But Timbuktu wasn't just a market town. It was a paper town. The real wealth of the city, especially by the 15th century, was in its books, contracts, and clerks. Its great families, like the Akites and the Sankoris, bureaucrats. The famous Sankore University was less a formal campus than a constellation of scholarly households and mosque libraries, where knowledge was recorded and preserved. At the height of its influence, Timbuktu's bureaucracy tracked goods from across the known world. Salt from Tagaza and Taudini textiles from North Africa, spices and perfumes from Egypt, slaves in gold from the Sahel and forests beyond. Each merchant filed paperwork. Every caravan was registered. Scribes documented weights, origins, destination markets, and tax obligations. These documents, written in classical Arabic script, were kept in family libraries and local registries. Some survive today, tucked away in climate-worn trunks, passed down for generations. Bureaucracy and survival in the Sahel. What might strike the modern reader as mundane, forms, taxes, inventory records, was in fact a survival mechanism. The desert was brutal and unpredictable. A single sandstorm could wipe out a caravan. Bandit raids were common. Bureaucracy created predictability, reducing the risk of chaos. Timbuktu's bureaucrats functioned almost like notaries and insurance agents. They verified ownership, arranged partnerships, and arbitrated disputes in an environment where physical goods could vanish in transit. Paper, signed, witnessed, and sealed, became the only real protection. This system of administration allowed trade to flourish on a massive scale. Timbuktu's economy wasn't just camel-driven, it was clerk-driven. The salt market and its systems. Upon arrival in Timbuktu, caravans were directed to the Asara market, where salt was offloaded, sorted, and sold. Buyers from the Niger Delta mossy lands and beyond, ivory, leather, shea butter, even grain. Exchange rates between salt and these goods fluctuated with supply and season. Scribes sat nearby to notarize deals. The salt itself was graded by quality. Some slabs had impurities, sand or clay veins, while others were prized for their clean, flaky texture. The best grades fetched top prices and were often sold north again, to be traded for books, metal goods, or horses. Salt also paid taxes. Timbuktu's rulers, first the Mali Empire, then the Songhai, levied a fixed duty on each slab brought in or sold. Tax collectors documented these with quill pens and reed ink, often copying receipts 3 times. One for the merchant, one for the local judge, and one for the city archive. It is no coincidence that the Arabic word diwan, meaning bureau or registry, was frequently used in Timbuktu. The economy lived in ledgers as much as in markets. Salt and slavery. One of the darker aspects of the salt trade was its dependence on slave labor. The mines at Tagaza were worked primarily by enslaved people, captured through local warfare or purchased in distant markets. Many were sent to their deaths. The mines were hot, waterless, and filled with salt dust that eroded flesh and lung. Slaves also accompanied caravans, carrying supplies, guarding goods, serving as porters and cooks. Some were sold upon arrival in Timbuktu or bartered for new goods. The same bureaucracy that preserved book knowledge and economic contracts also legalized human bondage. Records from Timbuktu note names, ages, and conditions of sale for enslaved individuals, along with caveats regarding treatment and resale. These documents, troubling in their detail, reflect the normalization of palaces or towering cathedrals. Buildings were made from mud brick, softened by rains and heat. But what the city lacked in grandeur, it made up for in organization and resilience. There was no police force in the European sense. Instead, there were faqirs, religious judges who governed legal disputes using Islamic law and commercial precedent. There was no mint, but currency flowed in salt, gold, and cloth. There were no standing armies, but the city defended itself through alliances, contracts, and shared interest in keeping trade flowing. The salt roads that fed Timbuktu were arteries not only of goods, but of thought. Arabic grammar manuals, Quranic commentaries, and legal digests arrived with each new caravan. In return, Timbuktu exported scholars, scribes, and judges to other parts of West Africa. It was a system built not on conquest, but on cooperation and record-keeping. On trust. But what happens when empires shift, when power centers move, and when the bureaucracies that uphold these systems begin to decay? Empires, scholars, and the machinery of desert trade. The salt caravans trudged on, year after year, through dust storms and searing heat, their camel bells echoing across the dunes. But no trade network can remain static forever. As Timbuktu's importance grew, so too did the attention of empires, dynasties, and ambitious rulers seeking to control the wealth that flowed through this desert city. In this section, we trace the rise and transformation of Timbuktu under imperial hands, explore its intellectual flowering, and examine how the desert bureaucracy evolved to sustain one of history's most fascinating commercial hubs. The Mali Empire and the Salt Gold Nexus. By the 13th century, Timbuktu had been folded into the Mali Empire, a powerful West African kingdom founded by Sundiata Keita. This empire controlled rich gold mines to the south along the Niger River basin, and the rulers quickly recognized the value of the Saharan salt trade. Salt and gold became symbiotic. Caravans brought saltward and returned north with gold dust. This exchange enriched Mali's coffers, funding armies, royal courts, and monumental mosques. Under Mansa Musa, perhaps the most famous of Mali's rulers, Timbuktu reached new heights of prosperity. Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 is often described for its opulence. Hundreds of camels laden with gold, but its bureaucratic implications are equally fascinating. The pilgrimage solidified Islamic legal and administrative practices across Mali, including Timbuktu. Judges trained in Mecca returned with new systems for taxation and trade oversight. Timbuktu's market scribes adapted these methods, refining the registration of caravans and standardizing contracts that crossed language and ethnic barriers. The Songhai Empire and military protection in the late 15th century. Power shifted as the Songhai Empire supplanted Mali as the dominant force in the region. Timbuktu, by then a renowned center of learning and trade, became part of Songhai's administrative heartland. Under rulers like Sani Ali and Askia Muhammad, Songhai invested in protecting trade routes. Patrols guarded wells and caravan tracks. Fortified outposts deterred bandits. For the first time, large-scale state resources were dedicated to maintaining the safety of salt caravans. Songhai rulers also expanded bureaucratic oversight. Tax records became more complex, noting not only salt slabs, but also byproducts like dried fish, leather, and textiles carried alongside them. Imperial inspectors traveled with caravans to ensure fair taxation and compliance with trade laws. This integration of military power with administrative precision allowed the salt trade to flourish on an scholarly Timbuktu, the intellectual backbone. While empires fought for dominance, Timbuktu quietly blossomed into a scholarly capital. The city's mosques, Sankore, Jingarabur, and Sidi Yahya, became centers of advanced learning. Students from across West Africa flocked to Timbuktu to study theology, law, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The city's bureaucracy intertwined with this intellectual life. Many of the same scholars who taught in mosques also served as legal advisors, notaries, and judges. Contracts for salt caravans were often drafted and authenticated by these learned men. Disputes between traders were settled not through violence, but through fatwas, legal opinions, grounded in Islamic jurisprudence. The manuscript culture, Timbuktu's most enduring legacy, is its manuscripts. Tens of thousands of handwritten texts preserved in family libraries. These were not just religious treatises, but practical documents. Trade agreements, tax ledgers, medical handbooks, agricultural manuals, letters between merchants and caravan leaders. Some manuscripts detailed caravan logistics with astonishing specificity. Distances between wells, safe passage tolls, risk assessments for seasonal banditry. Others provided guides for calculating exchange rates between salt, gold, and cloth, ensuring fair deals across distant markets. These documents highlight a culture where knowledge was not abstract, but actively applied to governance and trade. Bureaucracy, in this sense, was an intellectual pursuit, a collaboration between scholars and merchants that allowed commerce to thrive in an environment otherwise hostile to human survival. Desert cities beyond Timbuktu. Timbuktu was not alone in this desert bureaucracy. Cities like Gao and Walata served as complementary nodes. Gao, situated east along the Niger River, functioned as a storage and redistribution center with its own registries of salt shipments and tax offices. Walata, further north, acted as a staging point for caravans crossing the deepest Sahara. Together, these cities formed an administrative network that transcended tribal and linguistic divisions. A contract notarized in Timbuktu could be recognized and enforced in Gao or Walata, a remarkable achievement for the 15th century, predating many European commercial codes of similar sophistication. Women and trade administration. Though often overlooked, women played significant roles in Timbuktu's bureaucracy. While the desert caravans were led by men, women in urban centers managed finances, oversaw household workshops, producing trade goods, and maintained family libraries, where contracts and tax receive were stored. Certain wealthy women became patrons of scholarship and mosque construction. Records show female scribes and copyists working alongside male scholars. Widows of merchants frequently inherited trading licenses and continued running commercial enterprises, sometimes employing teams of clerks to manage documentation. Salt's journey beyond Timbuktu. Once salt reached Timbuktu, it didn't simply stop there. The city was a hub, redistributing salt further south and east. To the Niger Delta, fishermen used salt to preserve catches, enabling trade in dried fish. To forest kingdoms, salt was exchanged for cola nuts, ivory, and slaves. To distant markets, some salt slabs traveled thousands of miles, reaching Hausa city-states and even stretching eastward into the Kanem-Bornu Empire. Each transaction was documented. Caravan leaders carried bundles of papers, permits, receipts, credit notes that allowed them to navigate complex webs of taxation and tariffs. Much like modern bills of lading, these documents ensured goods could pass safely through multiple jurisdictions without being seized or double taxed. Justice in the desert. The prosperity of Timbuktu's trade depended on reliable dispute resolution. Conflicts over unpaid debts or contested shipments were common. Instead of descending into feuds, merchants brought grievances before qadis, Islamic judges, whose rulings were based on Sharia law and local custom. Case records from Timbuktu describe arbitration sessions held under mosque porticos. Witnesses were called, contracts reviewed, and settlements negotiated. Decisions were copied into bound ledgers, creating precedents for future cases. This early form of commercial law provided stability and predictability vital to long-distance trade. Plagues, famines, and bureaucratic resilience. Even in this well-oiled system, crises struck. Droughts dried wells, causing caravans to lose camels and goods. Famine disrupted local economies. The arrival of plague in North Africa in the 14th century threatened to sever Saharan links altogether. Yet remarkably, Timbuktu's administration adapted. Tax rates were temporarily lowered during famines to encourage continued trade. Emergency funds were drawn from mosque treasuries to finance caravan rescues. Laws regulating water rights were rewritten to ensure equitable access for both traders and nomads. This flexibility, bureaucratic rather than military, helped sustain the salt roads for centuries when more rigid systems might have collapsed. The influx of Moroccan influence. By the late 16th century, Moroccan forces under Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur sought to control the wealth of the salt and gold trade. Armed with early firearms, Battle of Tondibi, 1591, and captured Timbuktu. The Moroccan occupation introduced new layers of administration. Governors sent from Marrakesh imposed taxes and attempted to centralize trade under Moroccan oversight. Yet, they relied heavily on existing Timbuktu scribes and judges to manage daily operations. The bureaucracy proved too entrenched and locally knowledgeable to be replaced outright. While Moroccan rule disrupted the balance of power, it paradoxically demonstrated the resilience of the Salt Road administration. Caravans continued to cross the Sahara. Scribes still notarized contracts, and Timbuktu's manuscripts multiplied despite foreign domination. The slow shadow of decline. By the early 17th century, external pressures began to erode Timbuktu's prominence. Shifting trade routes toward Atlantic ports reduced trans-Saharan commerce. Moroccan garrisons drained resources without adequately protecting caravans. Political instability provided by Songhai rulers. Despite these challenges, Timbuktu remained a center of learning and administration for decades, longer than many historians credit. Only gradually did caravan traffic wane, manuscripts gather dust, and bureaucratic offices fall quiet. Yet, even as its power receded, Timbuktu's legacy endured, not in monuments or armies, but in the delicate manuscripts that outlived empires. These silent pages preserved centuries of economic and legal thought, capturing the hum of a bureaucracy that once orchestrated one of the most remarkable trade systems in history. But how did Timbuktu finally lose its salt-fed wealth entirely? And what became of the libraries and registries that defined it? Could such an advanced system of desert administration simply vanish? Or did it transform into something else, hidden from modern eyes? The fading caravans and the quiet legacy of Timbuktu. By the early 17th century, the golden hum of Timbuktu's salt-driven bureaucracy began to wane. The camel bells that had once sounded like clockwork through desert passes rang less frequently. The great ledgers of tax and trade, filled for centuries with neat Arabic script, slowly thinned. Yet the city did not vanish overnight. Instead, Timbuktu entered a long twilight, an age of slow erosion rather than dramatic collapse. This section traces that decline, how shifting trade routes, colonial expansions, and changing technologies dismantled the salt roads. What happened to Timbuktu's scholars and manuscripts, and how, despite centuries of neglect and mythologizing, the city's quiet legacy continues to shape ideas of administration and resilience. The Atlantic shift, the first blow to Timbuktu's economic dominance, came not from desert sands or drought, but from oceans. By the late 15th century, ships carrying salt, gold, and other goods began bypassing the grueling desert caravans entirely. Atlantic ports like Elmina and Luanda grew into thriving trade centers, connecting Europe to African goods through maritime commerce. Unlike desert routes, these sea lanes offered speed, larger cargo capacities, and fewer intermediaries. Overland salt caravans with their slow and expensive camel trains, could not compete. Merchants who once trekked through Saharan oases now redirected wealth toward coastal trading posts. This diverted not only goods, but also information and financial power away from Timbuktu. The city's careful registry system, once a linchpin of trans-Saharan commerce, lost relevance as international trade shifted to ships and harbors. Moroccan mismanagement. The Moroccan conquest of Timbuktu in 1591 further strained the desert bureaucracy. Sultan Ahmed el-Mansur sought to centralize control over gold and salt revenues, hoping to finance his ambitions in North Africa and Europe. Yet Morocco's appointed governors, far from skilled administrators, struggled to manage Timbuktu's delicate systems. Caravans became targets for corrupt officials and unpaid soldiers. Taxes were raised unsustainably high, driving merchants to alternative routes or discouraging trade. Altogether, Moroccan troops garrisoned in Timbuktu often clashed with local scholars and elites who had long balanced trade interests with scholarship and governance. Over time, these tensions disrupted the quiet bureaucratic machinery that had kept the desert economy stable for centuries. Decline of the salt mines. Simultaneously, the once vital salt mines of Tagaza and Taudeni experienced their own declines. Frequent raids, poor management, and production. The great caravans dwindled in number, weakening the economic pulse that fed Timbuktu. Scholarship under siege. Even as the economic lifeblood slowed, Timbuktu's intellectual community persisted. Scholars continued to write, teach, and preserve manuscripts, but they faced new threats: censorship and exile. Moroccan authorities, suspicious of scholars' influence, exiled some intellectuals or imposed restrictions on teaching. Resource shortages. Reduced trade meant fewer supplies for parchment, ink, and copying, slowing manuscript production. Political fragmentation. Without unified Songhai or Mali oversight, academic networks fractured and scholarly exchanges diminished. Despite these challenges, Timbuktu scholars managed to preserve thousands of texts. Families safeguarded manuscripts in private libraries, hidden in mud brick walls, or buried underground during times of conflict. These faltered. Timbuktu's bureaucratic memory survived on paper. European encounters and misunderstandings. When European explorers and colonial agents first reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, they encountered a city far quieter than its medieval reputation suggested. Lacking grand stone monuments or visible wealth, Europeans assumed Timbuktu had been little more than legend. What they failed to understand was that Timbuktu's greatness had never been built on ostentatious architecture or centralized military might. Its power lay in networks, knowledge, and administration, intangibles that left few physical ruins. European colonial records often dismissed the intricate systems of notarization, caravan management, and tax ledgers as primitive, overlooking that these structures had once rivaled or surpassed many European institutions in efficiency and reach. Colonial disruption. French colonization in the late 19th century dealt the final blow to what remained of Timbuktu's salt bureaucracy. Colonial administrations imposed European legal systems, bypassing traditional Qadi courts and replacing centuries-old registries with imported notarial practices. The trans-Saharan caravans, already reduced to shadows of their former size, were rendered obsolete by railroads and modern shipping. Camels, once indispensable, became symbols of nostalgia rather than engines of economy. The knowledge of desert navigation, tax documentation, and caravan accounting faded as fewer people practiced these skills. The survival of manuscripts. Yet, amidst this upheaval, Timbuktu's manuscripts endured. Families who had preserved texts through wars and occupations continued to guard them through the colonial era. Hidden in wooden trunks, goatskin satchels, and earthen jars, these manuscripts survived dust storms, termites, and political upheaval. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that their full scale became known. Tens of thousands of texts, covering subjects from astronomy to medicine to commercial law, were rediscovered and cataloged. Among them were caravan contracts, salt trade agreements, and legal commentaries that revealed the sophistication of Timbuktu's lost bureaucracy. These manuscripts challenged centuries of misconceptions, proving that the city's legacy had been intellectual and administrative rather than monumental. Timbuktu had been a living archive long before modern libraries conceived of such organization. Echoes of bureaucratic ingenuity. Though the salt roads are gone, elements of Timbuktu's bureaucratic genius resonate in modern systems. Trade documentation. The concept of notarized caravan contracts mirrors modern bills of lading and customs forms used in international shipping. Credit networks. Timbuktu merchants developed trust-based credit arrangements centuries before European banking formalized similar practices. Water rights management. Desert law codes governing wells and oases prefigure contemporary environmental regulations on shared resources. Legal arbitration. The Qadi court system anticipated modern commercial arbitration, resolving disputes through documentation rather than violence. These parallels suggest that Timbuktu's seemingly dusty paperwork was far ahead of its time, offering lessons in resilience and adaptability still relevant today. A quiet legacy. Today, the image of Timbuktu remains romanticized, a lost city of gold, or a symbol of remoteness. Yet its real legacy is quieter, rooted in clerks' ink-stained fingers, in caravan leaders counting salt slabs under desert stars, and in the meticulous notes of scholars balancing trade with theology. The city's story is not one of sudden ruin, but of transformation. The salt caravans faded, but the methods of administration they inspired lived on in hidden manuscripts and in the memory of communities that once thrived by navigating scarcity through organization. Reflections, dust and paper. When you imagine the Sahara now, picture not just dunes and camels, but the invisible infrastructure that once threaded them together. Picture wax seals pressed into parchment, contracts rolled and tied with twine, clerks huddled in shadowed corners of mud brick mosques, tallying salt slabs with reed pens. It is tempting to call Timbuktu's rise and fall a tragedy, but perhaps that is not accurate. The desert, after all, swallows everything eventually. Caravans, empires, even bureaucracies. What survives is not grandeur, but subtlety. The lingering wisdom of how humans can create order in chaos, forge cooperation across vast distances. In the end, Timbuktu reminds us that history is not always written in stone. Sometimes it is preserved in soft paper and drifting dust, waiting for someone to lift the lid of a wooden trunk and find a world of ink, still whispering across centuries. Dot.